Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 10, and this is Lesson 20. I was giving you some examples, and we only got one of those verses out, but I was giving you some examples of what it means to have Christ in us, that only by those things happening is Paul able to write, I take pleasure in infirmities, and those other things. Here's another one. 2 Corinthians 12:9, and he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Then Paul says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in mine infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. That can only truly be said when Christ is dwelling in our hearts, when He is living His life in us, when we are being conformed to the image of God's Son, when that Word is doing its effectual work in us, when we are truly being edified unto godliness, when Christ is being formed in us. Those are all elements that pertain to Christ in us. That's the transforming power that we're looking for in our own lives. And then one more, 2 Thessalonians 1:4. So that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God. And look what he says, we glory in you for your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that ye endure. So the church was going through persecutions and tribulations at Thessalonica, and they were enduring that. And he's actually talking about this. And by the way, the Thessalonians couldn't do that. They couldn't exhibit that patience and faith in the midst of those things that they were enduring. See, isn't it worth noting that Paul didn't say, hey, pray and just ask God to take those things away? What he was interested in is Christ being formed in them in the midst of those things. Because a glory is being put on display. What is that glory? The glory is Christ in us. That, folks, that's the treasure that's in these earthen vessels. That's the riches that we get. I mean, it's just great stuff. And I'd say more, but I'll start coughing. So, he knows, well, let me just read it to you, 2 Corinthians 4:17, for our light affliction. And look, Paul is saying that. He's only saying that it's light. He's not being sarcastic. He's saying, in comparison to something else, this is light. But Paul's afflictions were significant as far as what was actually taking place with him. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment. How long did Paul have to suffer those things? Till he died. The rest of his life. Worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. What is the glory? The glory that, look, when Mark said a while ago, the hope of glory, that is not hope like I sure hope I get it. That's the earnest expectation of the glory of Christ in us. When Christ is formed in us, there is a glory that is being put on display. Whose glory is that? Yeah, it's His glory, isn't it? He's the one being put on display. He's the one dwelling in our hearts. He's the one living His life in us. He's the one we're being conformed to. And so, Paul can say this because he knows the exceeding greatness of His power to usward who believe. I'm just quoting that verse that we've already read several times. And what is that power? That is the power that puts on display The sufficiency of God's grace in the midst of terrible circumstances. Okay, look, if you don't hear it now, you won't hear it when terrible circumstances are on you. That's what you call bad timing. See, I'm just trying to think, because there's people that are watching this other than just this group right here. I'm just trying to formulate this so it'll be right. Because some of them may actually be going through something right now. But let me tell you, the best time to learn this is when you're not in the midst of some traumatic situation. If you are in the midst of a traumatic situation, then may I say to you, His grace is still sufficient. And how do you appropriate that grace? By looking at the doctrine, by believing that doctrine and trusting that doctrine to allow you to go through it without being overwhelmed. May I say to you what most people do? Most people just go through it because they tough it out. That's what most of us do. You know why? It's all we know how to do. We've never been taught how to do it any other way. And they go through it. And at the end, if they're believers, you know what they say? If it wasn't for the Lord, I'd have never got through that. But they went through it the same way a guy went through it who doesn't believe in the Lord. If you're really appropriating that grace, if Christ is living His life in you in that area, do you know what you'll be thinking? Do you know what gets produced in you? Therefore, I take pleasure in these things. For when I am weak, then am I strong. How is that possible? Because it's not in Paul, it's in the power of God's grace to sustain him in the midst of that. And he realizes that's when that happens. Then you'd be saying things like, I will rather glory in mine infirmities. Why? That the power of Christ may rest upon me. This is not the power to make thunder roll and lightning flash. This is the power to do just what was happening with the Thessalonians, to have patience and faith in all their persecutions and tribulations. That's the power of Christ that allows them to go through that and to understand that what is happening in them is a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. That Christ is being put on display in them. His grace, the power of His grace to sustain them is being put on display. And when Paul's looking at that and saying, look, I can either put the power of God's grace on display for the world to see, or I can just deal with it the best I can. He's just saying, I'd rather have that. I'd rather have that. And may I say that the things that you're going through, you're going to go through them anyway. Why not have the okay, I think you get it. So, Christ in us. So you know what that is? That's His life in us. It is also His grace in us. And that's why we talk about the transforming power of God's grace being the greatest power God possesses. Greater than His power to speak the worlds into existence, greater than His power to part the Red Sea, greater than His power to walk on water, greater than His power to feed 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes. Greater than that is the power that works in us. So that Christ is actually now living His life in us. That is a greater power. It is the exceeding an eternal weight of glory. And God is wanting to put that on display for everyone to see. Now, when I thought about this, I thought about an old commercial. When I was a kid, they used to have a Shell gasoline commercial. And they were advertising Shell with Platformate. Does anybody remember that? I'm the only one old enough to remember that in here. Shell with Platformate. And what they did is they mounted a gallon container on the top of a car. They went out into the desert where they had just a straight shot, and this car took off. Now, the only thing you're hearing in the commercial is the moderator talking. But you see the car take off, and a few seconds later, you see all the gas has come down out of that clear container, and it rolls to a stop. And the moderator says, this is gas without Platformate. Then they got another identical car. They got that clear gallon of gas in it. And it says, and this is Shell with Platformate. And you see the car take off. And in a few seconds, they flash by. And this car goes whizzing by the first car and goes way off into the distance. And then they take a final shot where that car finally comes to an end. And you can't even see the other car. And they go, get Shell with Platformate. Do you know what Platformate was? It was their trade term for octane. You do realize every gas has octane. Those little numbers that you see on the buttons you push at the pump, that's the amount of octane that is in the gas. Every gas has octane. The reason the commercial was silent as far as what was going on is because in reality, the first car just almost didn't get started. It clattered and knocked, and because it didn't have any octane in it. And it didn't go very far because it was just sputtering and wheezing, and the engine was knocking, and the thing finally coasted to a stop. So what they were really saying is, here's gas without octane in it. But they didn't say octane, they said Platformate, because everybody saw the commercial thought, well, I got to get Shell, because I can get really good gas mileage. You cannot. No, but they ran it in a car and it didn't go very far. No wonder the gas with octane took the car further, and all you saw in the first car was it started off and then it coasted to a stop, and that's really all you saw. All right, so you know what they're doing, obviously. Now, that probably a bad example because that's a little deceptive, isn't it? But you know what they were doing is they were trying to show how superior Shell with Platformate was. Well, may I say to you that we are the showcase for God's octane. Do you know what His octane is? Christ in us. That's God's octane. You can try to live a life without octane, but it's just sputtering and knocking and banging, and it really doesn't go very far. And if it encounters anything, no wonder this was in the desert. The first car couldn't pull a hill. It was just on a flat surface. The only way they could do this. So, if you want a life without, I don't want to, holy octane. I'm just, my mind is just thinking, If you want to live that kind of life, that's what everybody is living. And that's why some of them can't pull the hills in life. They don't have enough power. Now, other folks, in and of themselves, they do better with that. But you know what? It's one thing to say, I'm just going to tough it out. It's another thing to see the eternal weight of glory that is being put on display in you and the all-sufficiency of God's grace, and really having the power of God's grace give you a patient endurance of the things that are just overwhelming other people. And to have that happen in you, it's not us, that's Him. That's why I never in all my life of going to church, and I went to church a lot in my life. We never missed. But I never heard anybody stand up and say what Paul has written in those verses I just showed you. That, you know what? Well, you know what? I'm just going to go back and get them all, aren't I? I take pleasure in these infirmities because the power of God's grace is at work in me, and it causes me to go through these, knowing that something much greater than these afflictions is being put on display. I'm glorying in these infirmities so that the power of God... I never heard anybody talk like that. Or to say, you know, the patience and faith of these tribulations are resulting in a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. I just never... Why? Because we don't think about it that way. The only way you think about it is to understand that those verses... you know what I'm doing now? I'm confronting you with the verses, with the doctrine that says that. And when you understand that and you believe it... Now, if you don't believe it, you're stuck right there. But if you believe it, and now you have to trust that word... Do you remember when I talked to you at the start about our sonship establishment, that there was two main things that it was trying to do before you got into the education? And that is convince you that your Father has not overlooked anything, and everything He said to you can be trusted and believed, and that His Word, number two, will accomplish everything He said it would accomplish. That is the issue right here. And when we do that, that's when Christ is dwelling in our hearts by faith, because that's what we're doing. We're trusting that Word to do what He said it would do. Okay, so with that in mind, any question? All right? So now let's go to the last reason. Before I gave you a whole list of reasons why Paul wrote, we know not what we should pray for as we ought, and here they are in a brief recap. So, first of all, because we're superstitious Gentiles, and we pray like that, because that's how we think. Because of erroneous religious traditions that govern our prayer lives, that got handed down from generation to generation. Everybody automatically believed it was true, even though it was never taught in the Word for us. Because our flesh influences our prayers toward the physical, material, and temporal things of life, and not the eternal, inner man issues. And now, here comes the last reason. Look, there is a method to this. I stopped right there, and I said, before I give you the last reason, I'm going to talk to you about two things. The first thing is, I'm going to talk to you about the power of God. You remember that? And I went back and I showed you 5 powers that Paul referred to in his epistles, and what did we find that they all had in common? They were all powers that worked in the inner man. Paul never talked about God intervening in the physical circumstances. I wanted you to notice that. All the power was all an inner man power to transform you, to conform you, to have Christ formed in you. It was all that. And then I said in here, and then, see, I thought this was really good. You have no appreciation for the genius of your preacher. You should be weeping. Okay, look. So we talked about the power of God, and then I said, and now I'm going to ask us 2 questions. The first one is, why did God put us in Christ? The second one is, why does God want Christ in us? Because when you understand those things, now you're ready for the last issue. Here it is. We know not what we should pray for as we ought, because prayer is a dispensational issue. So let me ask you a question. Well, did people all through the different ages pray? Sure they did. Absolutely. But if we pray like Daniel prayed, and I'm going to show you this, That would be a complete waste of your time. Because what Daniel was praying about, God is not interested in doing that one bit in this dispensation of grace. Prayer is a dispensational issue. See, the clock is either running on Israel's program or it's running on the mystery program. It's either running for Israel or it's running for Gentiles. But you got to figure out where you are, you know. So, look, when the ball game is called at halftime, it doesn't matter how many times you cross the goal line at halftime. You know why? I mean, you can actually cross the goal line. It doesn't give you a touchdown. Why? Because the game is not in play. God had a program. Look, this. God has a program with Israel, and they're praying in connection with that program. But when God stops that program and does halftime with us, that's a whole different thing. Now, when this is over, God will resume and complete that program with Israel. And prayer is going to change again. So I want to show you some examples of this. So, first of all, I want to define the terms. Prayer is simply talking to God. We're assuming that folks are talking to the true and living God. Prayer that is done properly is a constant communication with Him. And I'm going to tell you and show you some things about that is going to make this easier. But prayer is a constant communication with God. And intelligent prayer, that is, look, okay. Prayer, talking to God. Well, let me ask you a question. Is this talking to God? Dear God, we need rain. Please send us some rain. You are talking to Him. But you know in this dispensation of grace, that is not a prayer that He is going to answer. It might rain eventually. Well, I guess it will rain eventually. So you have prayer, and then you have proper prayer, which is constant talking to God, constantly, about everything. I'm going to show you how to do this. And then we talked about intelligent prayer. And intelligent prayer is praying with the understanding that prayer is a dispensational issue. In other words, intelligent prayer is praying about or praying in accordance with what God is doing. I'm not talking about we're all high IQ people, intelligent prayer. I'm talking about you're praying because you're informed about what God is actually doing, and you're praying in connection with that. Now, as we said a while ago, saints in all the ages prayed, and that is true. And many of those prayers are recorded in our Bible. But even though they all prayed, you do realize not all of their prayers were the same. They weren't all praying for the same things or about the same things. And even those that were praying to the same God, their prayers were not identical. So what I want us to do is I want us to take a look at some of these prayers for one purpose, and that is for you to take notice that every time someone was praying, they were praying in accordance with what they understood that God was doing. So they were praying in a dispensational way. 2 Samuel chapter 7. Now, if you're looking at your notes in that, you already know the answer to this question. What is the subject of 2 Samuel chapter 7? The Davidic covenant. All of the details of the covenant are not given to you in 2 Samuel 7, but God is talking about the general issue of the covenant. there in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And to get that, and this is important to understand what it is that we're going to do. Oh, brother. So, 2 Samuel 7, you have to understand what's happening here. David has a palace, and he's concerned because God doesn't have a permanent... You know what? It's still just the tent. It's still just the tabernacle. And he wants to build God a grand house. And so, it says... and it came to pass when the king sat in his house and the Lord had given him rest round about from all of his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, see now, now this is King David, said unto Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. What's he talking about? In the tent, made of skins. Verse 11. And as since the time that I commanded judges to be... By the way, this is now God talking back to David. I'm abbreviating this, but look, can I just say it to you like this? The king says to Nathan, I want to build God a house. But, and you know what Nathan says in the beginning? Hey, if you think that's what you want to do, you should go for it, basically. But then the Lord later speaks to Nathan and says, tell David, I don't want him to build me a house. Instead, tell David, I am going to build him a house. But now we're talking about two different houses. What kind of house does David want to build for the Lord? The physical, material structure of the temple. But the house that God is talking about making for David is talking about his generational house. In other words, when you talk about he is of the house of David, what are you saying? He's of the house of David. He lives in the same building? Not necessarily. What does it mean? Yeah, it's his part of his relations. It's his descendant. His descendants are from. He's descended from David, and David's house is the generations that come from David. Well, let me ask you a question. Did anybody's house ever end? Was there ever a time when a house died off? Sure. There's a bunch of them in the Bible. But here's what God is going to say to David. I'm going to make a covenant with you that your house is going to endure forever. Now, what does that mean? It means David's line is never going to die out. It's never going to be extinguished. Why does God want to do that? He's going to make a covenant with David for certain things, and it's all going to be through David's line. So he has an interest in preserving David's house. So, and as since the time that this is God, I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies. Also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee, this is Nathan talking to David, he will make thee an house. Not a cedar house, because David already has one of those. He's talking about a house of generations. And so, verse 12 actually contains the explanation. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. Well, wait a minute. Who's the seed that he's talking about here? I'll establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. You know who this is. It's Solomon. He says, remember the previous verse. You tell David, I'm going to build him a house. He says, and David, you're going to get old, and you're going to die, and you're going to be buried, but I'm going to set up your seed after you, which we now know as Solomon, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom, how long? Forever. See, when Jesus comes back to set up his kingdom on this earth, he is going to sit on the throne of David. See, that has to be an eternal thing. It has to last all the way to the end. So God is making a promise here that He is going to establish David's house forever. Okay, I need to take a minute longer to get through this here. So, here's what's being promised here. The house that God is talking about building for David has three parts to it. First of all, verse 12, a seed. There that is. We've read that much. And and then I'll establish His kingdom. There's that part. And then right at the bottom, I didn't highlight it, and I will establish the throne of His kingdom. There's the third part. It's His seed, His throne, and His kingdom. There's the three elements. Do you see them all in the verse there? So there's the three elements, and He is going to establish them for how long? Forever. Forever. So when Christ comes, is He of the house of David? In fact, when you get to Matthew 1 and it talks about the genealogy, it talks about Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He just jumps immediately to the son of David. Why? Because that house, God said, I'm establishing this thing forever. It's not going to go away. And I'm establishing that throne of His and His kingdom forever. It's not going to go away. Everybody get that? Okay. So, God promised those things. And now, when David hears this, take a look. And 7:16. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. That's pretty plain, isn't it? So there's the three elements. So, look, okay. You know what I've noticed? I quit coughing. I'm almost afraid to take a break. All right, but this is the point. The buzzer went off, so we'll stop and we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll take, because this is going to get really interesting now. Okay, so we'll stop here.